What's going on, everyone? AP over here at Rumpier Sports. We're back. I think it's been a couple weeks now, Jordan, since we have done this show. We got the lineup builder show. We have a lot of new updates to go over, which I'm excited to break down and talk to you about because I have a ton of questions as well. And if you can, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Helps us out a lot. Jordan, what's going on, my man? How have you been doing over the past couple weeks?
Yeah, I've been going good. It's good to be back. I had a nice little vacation into Maui last week, so had a little rest and relaxation there. Ready to get back to it. Fired up here. There is no DFS down there in Hawaii, so I had a full break, totally reset here, and came back to some changes in the app. So there's been a couple things that have been updated here, some things that have been improved. Very heavily centered around ownership. I think the way that we're handling ownership is just much better now here, but I think it does take a little bit of getting used to. Anytime things change, obviously a little bit of an adjustment period there. So wanted to use this today, talking about some of these changes, talking about some of these improvements, why they are improvements, why this should just be better for your lineups. But also definitely answer some questions today. So chat, if you guys have questions for me, fire away. I know the first time you encounter some of this stuff, I think it's a little bit confusing. It was confusing to me. I had to ask a ton of questions to Matt and some of the other guys on our team that built these things. So if you have questions for me and APU as well, ask away. But I'm excited to be back and talking about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, right away, one thing I've noticed just when you go to build lineups, one of the toggles is gone. So
Yes.
the ownership one. So we have correlation, we have sim diversity, which are two that we talk about often. Can you walk through kind of why you got rid of that and what's going on with how you've adjusted the ownership stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the one thing we talk about here a lot on this show and some of our other our content here is the value of the simulations, right? We know that our play-by-play game simulations here is really a lot of what's powering the lineups behind the scenes here. And a lot of what we talk about when we talk about building a process is figuring out how best to work with those sims while adding your own value or bias into the process here, but ultimately to allow the simulation results to do the heavy lifting for the building of your lineups here. And one of the problems with the old ownership fade slider here, it did a decent job of handling ownership, but the problem is that it was affecting the simulation results itself. So we would take, let's say we've got the 4-game slate here tonight, right? We would take a sub-sample of simulations of these games on the slate here, and we'd take, what these guys scored in those games. And that would be the basis for how lineups were going to be built. But then we would adjust the outcomes of those sims based on the ownership of those players and based on what the ownership fade slider was set at. And that can sound like a good thing in practice, but the problem is once you start adjusting the simulation outcomes themselves, you put yourself in a position where you can potentially, there's some risk there. You could adjust those projections to an outcome that would never happen. Or you could take an outcome that's likely to happen that has a lot of upside. And because of where the ownership fade slider is set up, you've adjusted it out of that upside situation and ended up with a worse off lineup. It was too easy with the ownership fade slider to really kind of mess up. And as a part of that, we actually had to be kind of conservative with the way we would set the ownership fade slider to avoid people building bad lineups because of the way that worked. So the ownership handling now here in the app, I will say, is not gone. It's not like we're ignoring ownership. I think that's people's first reaction when they see this. They think, hey, we're not doing ownership anymore. That's not the case. What's happening now is instead it's after the build. We're valuing ownership more heavily in the way that we rank and sort lineups. So the simplest way to think about what's going on here is we're going to take the simmed outcomes and build lineups in a more direct way, and then find the lineups from those sets there that are lower owned, that fade some of the chalk, that still have that upside there. So that's basically what happened with the ownership fade slider.
Gotcha.
A couple other things I wanted to talk about here, but I mean, you have any questions for me on that right off the bat, AP?
I mean, when you get to that point in, I would assume step 3,
Yep.
where it's ranking, one other thing that I've noticed is there's many different options now.
Yeah.
Large field slates, small field slates. Is that where you're getting the difference there? Like is that where you're taking into consideration like how the ownership of one play is being impacted? Like if you have a 70% owned, I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe it's maybe it's like, gosh, I mean, I'm trying like maybe it's Donovan Mitchell gets ruled out tonight.
Mm-hmm.
70% owned Karis LeVert, which kind of is the case in NBA DFS right now because the field is pretty sharp. We all adjust to these plays.
Mm-hmm.
That where it's taken into account, like in those type of situations.
Yeah. So the Saber score, right? So this is basically what we're calling Saber score 2.0. And there's a couple components to this. So one, you do have different Saber scores here now that adjust that you can select for different slate sizes and different contest sizes. So that's what you're seeing here. Left side slate size. When we say small slate, we're basically talking about anything 5 games or less or so. Large slate is anything else. And then this is your contest size over here. And the one other thing we've done, actually, which is pretty cool here, is you now can actually see what's going into the Saber score. This was another piece of feedback we got a lot, especially from new players here or people new to Sabersim. What is Saber score, right? And I've talked about it here on the stream before. It's a way to quantify how good a lineup is. And people will say, well, that's great. That sounds good. But what is it? Like, what is the actual calculation there? And we never really had a great answer to that because that wasn't transparent in the app. It is now. So you can click this here and actually see basically what the Saber score is here. And this does get kind of mathy here. So I will try to get not too into the weeds here. But basically what we are actually doing here is we're taking the projection of the lineup, right? The projected sum. Then we're taking the 99th percentile of the lineup, right? This is the upside. This is how good does this lineup do when it really goes off? How high can it get up there into the leaderboards? And then we take the adjusted ownership. I'll talk about that in a second. The average ownership of the lineup and use that as a negative factor, right? So these are going to change based on the size of the slate and the contest you're playing. And so if we go instead, and let's say we're looking at a larger slate, but a smaller contest here, we're going to value ownership a little bit less, right? Ownership's going to come down on a larger slate naturally. We don't need to avoid the chalk as much as we do on smaller slates. Bigger contests, maybe we want to fade the chalk a little bit more, so we find the balance there. But the big thing, and I think what's really cool about this, is you have a little bit more control over how you want to sort these based on the contest you're playing. And you can actually see what they're doing. And in general, I think these metrics are actually going to be a little bit more aggressive than the old ownership fade slider because we know that all 1,500 lineups here are built from sims. They're not ownership adjusted ahead of time.
So let's do a quick example.
Yep.
Let's compare. All right. So let's look at the builds. We can see right here, we got Jared Allen, Nick Richards, both really nice plays. Both should get some ownership. And you can see the ownership. Cole Anthony, too, should get some ownership as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can we compare a single game and then compare it to large slate 50 and maybe 20 builds? Yep, that's how many we have. I just want to see, is there a noticeable difference in the lineups? And I guess we get.
Yeah. So let's do this here. So the most aggressive ownership fade setting you can use here is going to be small slate 50K plus for NBA, right? This is going to change for different sports, but This is going to be the most aggressively ownership fade. And for NBA, none of these are going to fade ownership too aggressively, right? Because chalk's pretty reliable, right? And you can still take stands with your own process, but in general, we're not going to fade a ton of ownership for you. But this is the most ownership fade aggressive setting we have. So on the chalkiest guys here, Cole Anthony right now, 75%. Evan Mobley, we have 70. The least ownership fade heavy option here will probably be large slate in a small field contest. So if we change it to that, you can see we're getting a little bit more Anthony and Mobley, right? We just kind of start playing the best plays a little bit more. So that's kind of the difference here. I'll do this again here. Large slate, so low ownership fade option here. We're getting a lot of Allen, Anthony, Gordon Hayward, smaller slate here. Some of the same names popping up here, but getting to some of the pieces that we think are going to be a little bit lower owned. And again, this is NBA, right?
Yep.
This will be very different for higher variance sports. Baseball coming up next week. It's actually pretty crazy how big of an impact there is there in a sport like that when you start changing these things here. So golf is another one. You can get some pretty big impacts when you start messing with these different settings.
Another thing too, if you don't want to mess with these settings at all, you can just turn the sliders all to 0 and turn it into a normal optimizer. So correct. I mean, that's one thing I want to, and that's why I like Saber. You can use it in so many different ways, from single entry 3 max to full on 150, and then using all these different settings. So I absolutely love that.
And I mean, one thing I would say, this is not intended to be confusing here, right? Like, it should not be. Choosing which one you're going to use for the slate should be pretty much as easy as what's the size of the slate and what contest are we playing. So if you're playing like, the flagship GPP tonight, right? I would say probably best practice, build it on the defaults. It's a small slate, 10 to 50K entrance. Do the rest of your process here like we normally talk about, right? Start tweaking projections, exposures, that kind of stuff. Let the Saber score do its thing behind the scenes, which is the same way we've always kind of done it, right? You just have a little bit more transparency there. So
no, that's cool. Yeah, good stuff. I know I kind of interrupted you, or maybe I took us on this tangent going into this. Is this a lot of what you're going to cover? Some of the changes.
Yeah, the other big one I want to talk about, and I actually think this is maybe the coolest change overall here, is this new adjusted ownership column here. So you're going to see this in a build, right? Also on the home screen here. So what is adjusted ownership, right? So what we are trying to do there is we are looking at the player's ownership projection, and we are looking at the variance of that player, right? How wide is that player's range of outcomes? Are they generally pretty reliable? Are they going to get to their projection often? And a lot of the outcomes are around there, or are they pretty unreliable? And then we are going to adjust the ownership projection based on more or less if we perceive that player to be good chalk or bad chalk. If they are good chalk, right? If they are low variance and they're going to get to their projection pretty reliably, we're going to adjust the ownership down. And we're basically saying, yeah, Cole Anthony is going to be about 41% owned tonight, but we think that ownership counts for actually a little bit closer to like 35% because in the Sims, he's reliably getting to his upside outcomes. For NBA, because variance is pretty low, most of the time, a lot of guys are just going to get adjusted down. That's basically saying a lot of chalk in NBA is actually pretty good. I want to show baseball real quick because I think this is really where it starts to click for people. This is a slate from last year. We don't have opening day sims up for next week just yet. We're working on that here, but let's look at the slate from last year. Right, this is a Coors Field slate where the Padres were playing in Coors Field. We have super chalk Padres, right? Manny Machado, Profar, Cronenworth, all these guys here. The adjusted ownership in this particular situation is actually higher than the actual ownership. We had Manny Machado at almost 43% owned in this slate here. Again, Coors Field. His adjusted ownership is 63%. We're basically saying he's way too highly owned for his range of outcomes. And you can actually see that here, right? Chalkiest batter on the slate, 14% of the time. Most common outcome, like 5 points. It's not going to get it done in a GPP. We're basically saying his ownership actually counts as if he was owned 63% of the time because he's that bad of chalk. In the actual...
That's interesting.
Yeah. So in the Saber score, right, that's this adjusted ownership. So we're not looking at just the raw ownership projection. We're looking at this adjusted ownership projection here to kind of count based on that player's individual sim outcomes. Is their ownership fair?
I get what you're like before we started this. I get what you're saying now, how this is, really geared towards, I mean, it obviously NBA too, but MLB. And when you think about and we're going to talk about MLB obviously opening days next week. This show will be all NBA or MLB, not NBA. And I get what you're saying now. Like, that's really interesting because your range of outcomes for any batter, the best batters in the world, I mean, they can still strike out. They can go 0 for 4, 0 for 5. And so as ownership goes up, I like that adjusted. So just kind of to summarize that, the adjusted ownership category, the bad chalk, you're adjusting up so that our lineups can kind of, bring that in and, according to what type of contest you're in. If it's a large field contest, decent sized slate, you're going to want to naturally fade that ownership. So it's kind of an extra buffer in there to fine tune things a little bit further. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I was looking to see if I can find a decent example here.
It makes so much sense because in the NBA it is tougher. I mean, I would say like Cole Anthony Chalk scares me a little bit, but
Yeah.
obviously Suggs is out and his usage off the bench is pretty nice, and he's not raw scoring dependent. So I kind of agree with that adjusted ownership projected, where it's just slightly bumped up over. But in baseball, it just is different. If anyone is projected to be massive chalk that's a hitter, obviously you're going to want to take that into consideration if you're multi-entering in a large field, especially.
Yeah, and then where this gets kind of cool, you start looking at something like pitchers here, right? And it's a little bit of a different story here, right? Some of these guys are still getting a bump here, right? So they're Frankie Montas on the slate here. Again, random slate from last year, was up against the Royals, not a very good team here, decent salary, was projecting to be a pretty chalky pitcher here. His adjusted ownership also is higher than his actual ownership. So we do think in this case here that he is a little bit of bad chalk, but not as much as the hitters here. And this isn't always a consistent trend, right? Sometimes you'll see, like, if you've got Justin Verlander in a great matchup or something like that, chalkiest pitcher on the slate by a mile, his adjusted ownership might actually be lower than his actual ownership if we perceive him to just be a spectacular play there, and maybe even should have been chalkier, right? So you get it. It's actually really fun. If you play multiple sports here, go through and look at some of your favorite sports here and see how that adjusted ownership compares to the Sabersim ownership or your ownership projections here, because it's interesting. I think it tells a lot about how reliable chalk is in different sports and different positions and things like that. So, yeah, there's a lot to look into there. One thing I was going to show here, if I can find kind of a good example. So in NBA, one of the situations where you will see guys where their adjusted ownership is higher than their Sabersim ownership is actually the really low projected pieces here, or the really low owned guys, right? So you might look at this and be like, okay, I'm looking for a low owned piece to throw into a lineup here. Maybe it's Shea, right? So maybe you're like, hey, Shea looks a little bit low owned here. We're actually saying that he's not getting to his upside outcomes enough in our sims to actually be even worth the 8% ownership we're projecting him for, right? And not by a ton. His adjusted is 1 point higher than his actual ownership. But that's basically what this number is saying. It's like, yeah, you can play some lineups with Shea. If you build lineups with Sabersim, you're probably going to get some with him in there. That's fine. But he's actually adjusted a little bit higher owned, because he's not getting to the upside outcomes you need here to even make sense at 8% ownership. So it's really interesting. I think you spent a lot of time digging into this. I've done it. It's quite a bit of fun. A different way, I think, of looking at ownership than what a lot of other people are used to. So,
gotcha. No, that's I like that. That's a good breakdown. Is there anything else that you want to hit on kind of before we do a rundown of the slate?
Yeah. So I do have one other thing. This is another this has been requested forever. Very excited about this. Our ownership projections, including adjusted ownership, are now updating after lock. So makes it even that much more powerful talking about the new Saber score and the adjusted ownership. If we get news breaks after lock here, let's see, do we have anybody? Kind of a small slate here. It doesn't look like a lot of questionable news here, especially post lock, but
Mitch Robinson. Oh, he's in the first game. There could be. It looks like we have most of the news, but it's a smaller slate. Maybe we get some kind of random news. The Hornets don't really have too many bodies anymore, so I'm not expecting too much on this slate.
Either way, the ownership now will rebuild after lock. So our sims will run like normal when starting lineups get confirmed and news breaks here. And then what happens is we will lock in the ownership projection for the players who have already started, and then rebuild the rest of the ownership. So
yesterday's slate would have been a great example. If you want to just go back to yesterday's, I know JSU, Big T, they were on the show last night breaking it down as the news was coming in. JSU, shout out to him. Got himself another 100K. Hashtag how rich, must be nice. No, seriously though, congrats to JSU. But he walked through it, and after that first game locked, and as the news hit, I believe he went all in on Toronto. So Toronto, we had Gary Trent and Scotty Barnes ruled out. When those two things happened, what I did, I actually used late swap, and I bumped up Chris Boucher. I basically thought he was a lock, and I got him into every single lineup. I bumped up Fred Van. So if you go to Toronto,
Yeah.
you guys will have this also adjusted, I believe. Yeah. So like before that news, there was a lot of unknowns. Will Barton ended up starting. He ended up being a bust, but is what it is. JC shipped with Will Barton in his lineup, actually. But I mean, I upgraded Pirtle, Boucher, Siakam, and Fred VanVleet, which I thought were the key guys. And so love to see that you're automatically. Let's look at where's the ownership project, or is it the adjusted ownership projection, or what is getting updated?
They both are. So we'll adjust that. So yeah, the Sabersim ownership will adjust here. This is what we actually. So it is important to note here, right? This number is what we actually project is the percentage of lineups in a contest that will have this player. So we think 53% of lineups in the contest
I think it was
after this news broke.
I think it was right around 50. It was right in the 50s. Same with Boucher. So very good.
And then this is the number we're using when we're ranking and sorting lineups. This is basically what we say is their adjusted ownership, right? Based on the variance of the player, how much ownership does that count for is the way I kind of think about it there. So yeah, it did update, right? And what's cool about this is like it will take into account, there's going to be slates sometimes where you get news like this, right? An elite value opens up at point guard or something like that. But if people have spent if there's a lot of lineups that are using a point guard playing in the earlier games, there's going to be less lineups available to get to that new value that's opened up. The rebuilding of ownership that we do will take that into account. So same thing with salary, right? Like let's say, that somebody's tied up a bunch of salary. There's an elite, like Giannis is playing in an early game at 12K that everybody wants to get Giannis. And then you open up some like good other expensive plays later in a game because of news that breaks and people just don't have the salary to get there anymore. That ownership's going to come in a little bit lower. We'll pick up on that as well here. So that one, I mean, people have really been asking for that forever. So
using that as an example, and let's just use yesterday's slate. Because I think this is like really important. The one readjust, like predicting what ownership will be or recalculating it when news hits, but then also, so if I'm hearing this right, also it's taking into account what the current person is already owned in contests that have already started. Is that correct? Like let's just say Jokic, he wasn't yesterday, but let's just say Jokic was like for some reason 70% owned. And now when you look at the rest of the studs on the slate after he's locked in, Luka, we had Steph Curry, we had Giannis, I believe, later on in the slate. Can't remember who. Anthony Davis as well. Very difficult for those guys all to have a lot of ownership, right? Since in this hypothetical, since Jokic was absorbing all of that early on. Is that correct? So
that's a good question. This is something I want to be very clear about. So we are. Let's say we projected Jokic for 5% owned, right? He actually comes in at 30% owned or something like that. We are going to rebuild ownership for the rest of the slate throughout the rest of the night, still using the 5% we originally had. We are not actually going into contests and pulling out the actual ownership that these players have.
Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
Is there a way to do that, though?
Yes,
because that would be really interesting.
We're working on that. That's where we ultimately want to take this. Is
I was going to say that would be sweet because it's like if you were just sometimes on big slates like that, even though it would be tough because the Wizards yesterday were without two key guys, Kyle Kuzma and Bradley Beal, and then Jokic is just Jokic. I thought he was underpriced. If you had the stones to just full fade that game, which I know a lot of people did at RPS. And then once you can see what that ownership is, and if you ever got a case where Jokic was just like super high owned, well, now you know that it would be very difficult for those other studs to be high owned. And if you had your optimizer being able to leverage and take advantage of that, it would be really nice. So love to see that that's in the works because that would be really sweet.
And there's differences between contests, right? The chalk's going to be a little bit chalkier.
Now, as like an MME player, now you have a lot, like a sport like NBA especially, you have a lot of decisions to make. You can now almost put a value on that first lock time, the first set of games. And that value is, does it make more sense to fade it, get an idea of what ownership is going to look like to be able to take some shots later on in the slate? So kind of a really interesting, argument that you can start to make as far as overall strategy goes.
Yeah, I definitely, and in NBA, I think in particular, it just makes sense. We talked about this in one of our shows a couple weeks ago to just value guys playing in later games a little bit more, just because you'll have more information by the time you're setting your lineups for those locks. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we were trying to do here and just what we've been doing with Sabersim really the past years, trying to remove as many barriers as possible from people late swapping, just because we really believe in the value of doing that for your lineups here. So
couldn't you though? All right, so let's just say we're in a late swap environment.
Yeah.
Couldn't you manually put in what the actual ownership was if you wanted to, like on your own, or not?
You can. A couple things on that note. So one, you can do that, but it's not rebuilding the rest of the ownerships from that. So you could come in here and be like, okay, Jokic was actually 30% owned. That's great. The adjusted ownership is going to change as well to account for that here. But it's not going to change Anthony Davis's ownership projection in the late game, right? You would then have to go in and do something like, okay, because Jokic was 30% owned, I think Anthony Davis is actually going to be 2% owned. Like, it won't rebuild based on what you're giving us. Yeah. So you can do it. It's not rebuilding the rest of the ownerships here. So
actually, I'm gonna next time we get a good size slate, probably be Friday. I'm gonna mess around with that big time, as long as we just because I think it's what I always do is that $4.20 max. I've been kind of testing out different MME strategies. More so thinking about heading into next season what I want to do, but that's like a perfect one where it's just like blindly fade some early games just for leverage and opportunity later on. I think is kind of an interesting argument.
Yeah, and the one other thing there too, obviously, right? If we are off on the ownership projection for a guy, right, and Jokic comes in at 30% owned or something like that, once you know what his ownership actually was, you can't get more or less Jokic than you already had. So it does affect how much Anthony Davis you might want, or how much like Luka you might want, or some of these other guys. But obviously, like the ship has sailed on Jokic in that case. So I think there's still some value to like thinking about, okay, what are the implications of this ownership projection having been a little bit off here? But it's not going to be able to change what you're doing with that actual player or that particular game. So
Austin Reeves would have been the fun one to get yesterday. And shout out to Bogards. We were talking about it yesterday from obviously the previous game. Austin Reeves has just been an absolute beast in his role, and it's been incredible to see for the Lakers. But shall we dive into and do an overview of tonight's slate?
Yeah, let's get into it here. I think that's about everything. There's quite a bit here that we had put out this last couple weeks here, but yeah, let's get into it.
Do you want to run just a quick base build? I have all of my stuff mapped out, but I haven't dove into it too deep yet.
Yeah, so what we'll do here first is we'll just build base build, right? So I set the sliders in this case at 0-1. Basically, we're trying to mimic a cash build, but I'm using the 0-1 sliders here to just build lineups a little more quickly. That runs a little bit quicker than the cash build. This will give us an idea of what the slate looks like here. It'll show us what the best projected plays are. The way I like to think about this is, what does every other person sitting down at their optimizer for tonight's slate get when they press build here? And it starts to show, what's going to be popular, where are some pivots, things like that. So yeah, let's take a look here. So we'll pull this up and start taking a look here. So this is the top. Let's actually look at like the top, 200 optimals maybe from this here instead. And I typically just kind of like to start looking here at like what names are popping off here, what teams, what is the value of some of these players here. So 4-game slate here tonight. No one projected above 6x value here at the moment. And what we're kind of getting is actually, I think, pretty spread out exposure here from the cash build here. A lot of times, if there are really good value plays, those guys will be in like 100% of lineups here. So
the adjusted ownership, just reviewing that one more time.
Yeah.
Gordon Hayward's is down, a couple points relative to the original ownership. What is that telling us again?
It's telling us that his ownership basically counts for less because he's a pretty good play. It's saying to you, very slightly, don't worry so much about this seeming chalky because he's a good play.
Is there any examples that you see off the top here of that metric aiming to a play being a bad play?
There probably won't be, and it's a generally good trend for NBA. I would say that the guys where you start to see it get kind of close or at least break even is like Eric Gordon. Nobody's really jumping out as a bad play. And that's again, that's an NBA thing, right? Like if we look at these guys, we've got Cole Anthony projected for about 30 points. He's going to be 40% owned. Almost all of his outcomes, he's scoring around his projection, right? It's like very easy for him to attain that score here. So you're not going to see it a lot for NBA, to be like totally honest. In baseball, there will be situations where guys are going to jump out as bad plays here. But for basketball, Sabersim is going to tell you generally a lot of times that the chalk is pretty good here.
Yeah. And I agree. Like Jared Allen, he's just way too cheap. Right off the bat. How much Jalen Brunson are we getting? Because Brunson is just, again, another guy who I feel is probably too cheap at 7-8, especially on a lower slate. So we're not getting a ton of Jalen Brunson.
22% here. And I think that, this is one of the good reasons to run this build in the first place, right? If you've got a take on a player here, you've done a little bit of research or something like that. If this doesn't look like we're getting enough, he should be one of those top plays. It's a good sign that this is one of the guys that we need to go back and give a little pump to. So. Yeah.
And then, so like a couple, I don't know if we want to just go back and then
let's go back.
Bias to it. I got kind of a rough over. So like I'm back on. So a bet I had, the Cavs played the Nets on Tuesday. I was on the Cleveland -4. And I mean, when Jared Allen's in there with Mobley, so like I was on the Nets for a long time. And then now I'm reversing that, especially like in certain matchups. This is one where I just think it's so tough for the Nets. Like they're all wings outside of Claxton. And then you got Mobley and Allen, who are two guys that can stretch out and help and basically guard 1 through 5 with all the other pieces that they have. And we saw it. Like Mikal Bridges couldn't get anything off. He's 9 for 21. They locked up Dinwiddie. Like it just is a tough matchup. The only reason it stayed somewhat close, I think the Cavs won by like 5 or 6, is Day'Ron Sharp came in and lit it up from off the bench. This dude was hitting threes. He was like literally 9 for 12, like couldn't miss a shot. He's the only reason they stayed in the game. I think Cleveland's going to smoke them again. I'm under on all the Nets pieces here. I do think bigs against Cleveland are always interesting, but I can't play Claxton at 6'8" when we got Jared Allen there at 6'3". So I'm always going to take Allen over him. And then the other thing with Cleveland is I don't want to play Mobley and Allen together. Even though like I saw some of those lineups right out of the gate there, I don't make a lot of rules in NBA, but this is one where I don't know if I want to play those two guys together in this matchup. I think it's going to be one of the guards and like Garland or Mitchell or even Karis LeVert. It's a 4-game slate. You can make the case to do weird things on 4-game slates. I think it's going to be one of those guys in Allen or Mobley that gets it done for us here. That's just kind of what I'm seeing with Cleveland. And the only reason I would make that rule is if I thought Allen and Mobley together in a lineup were going to be somewhat popular. And from those first builds we ran, it looked like that could be the case. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be like mega chalk or anything like that. I'm just saying there's going to be some correlated lineups out there that have Allen and Mobley together. And I would just rather avoid them for other options that we could find on this slate.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's a good way to use the cash build too, is looking at the constructions of lineups and thinking, are people going to do something that's negatively correlated in the actual games, right? And that might be a good way of getting some leverage with your groups here. You can see, right, just looking at the top values at the center position here, Allen and Mobley are 2 of the top 4, right? So it makes a lot of sense that there are going to be lineups that get those two guys paired together because people aren't thinking about that correlation together. The optimizers are just kind of putting those lineups out there. So I have no problem with that there. I like that a lot. I went ahead and set that rule here for folks that don't know how to do that here, right? New rule, group. And then you just pick the 2 guys you want in there, set the rule equal to use no more than 1. And we've got that rule here set up for those guys.
One thing that's also interesting, if we go to the late game, Russell Westbrook was actually like super efficient in the first quarter. I mean, he was hitting his shots. He was rebounding really well. he was, getting dimes out there, like, getting his guys teed up. His rotation, again, Ty Lue, very frustrated. And then you got OKC, very frustrating as well. I did not understand the rotation. He did not come back into the game until like the 3-minute mark in the second. And then we saw the same thing in the second half. And that's coming off of the 2 games previously where he had a nice rotation. He's playing mid-30s, upper 30s. So now we have Paul George out for this game, which is going to be interesting. Like like Kawhi Leonard has to be a phenomenal play. I still like Russ. Like I like point guards against OKC right now. Can we trust Russ? I mean, it's going to be really for him. It's like a true ownership type of thing for him. If he's going to be chalk, I would fade him all day. If he's going to be low owned, I love him as a tournament play because there's so many different outcomes, without Paul George in there. The other thing, too, is what I've seen is Eric Gordon's picked up a nice role. He's a vet. I could see him having an extended run here. I could see him starting, too. The other guy is Terrence Mann, who could get some extra run as well. But I don't like him as – this is going to be one of those things where it's like, man, you want to – right now all we can do is speculate. I think Gordon is going to start, which makes me like Mann a little bit less. And then Marcus Morris is just, gosh, if he's going to be chalk, I'd rather be under on that. And then Zubac and Plumlee, kind of like we don't really like centers against OKC right now because they go small. And if they go small again, Ty Lue can always counter because he's got Robert Covington. He's got these other pieces that he can counter with. So I don't trust the bigs here. So really it comes down to Kawhi Leonard, Eric Gordon. And then it's like, what do we do with Russ? I mean, that for me is what this situation comes down to with LAC for the guys that we can trust. And then on the OKC side, I mean, gosh, the only guys that we can trust right now, in my opinion, are Jalen, Jalen, so not Jalen with a Y. His rotation has been solid. And Shea. And then maybe Giddey, but it's like, I don't know. I don't want to pay top dollar for Giddey when Shea's in there. Those are literally the only 2 guys I can trust. Now, if you're running 150, you can take advantage of that. You can just kind of mix and match, get overweight on some of these random guys in their random rotation. But I play 3 lineups typically, and or the 20 max strategy, and it's just been better not even to mess with it and to bump guys like Isaiah Joe, Jalen Williams, especially bump them all down, or just even like cross them off. But that's kind of how I see this late game. The other thing too is I know like OKC, they like to play with pace, but the Clippers just love slowing things down. Now, if we know Russ is going to have more minutes, which we don't, he plays with pace. He just can't help himself. But when Russ is on the bench, the game just slows way down because that's what Ty Lue likes to do. Now, if we go to the Hornets and Pelicans game, New Orleans looked awesome the other night, but that was, I think, against the Spurs. I believe Joval crushed. Another just phenomenal spot for Joval. Yeah, so they played the Spurs. Joval in 27 minutes, 45 DK points. Joval, in my opinion, still underpriced. I think this Hornets team, they're trying to compete. It isn't going well, but if they can just stay within striking distance, keep it within 15 points in the fourth, you're going to see the Pelicans run their normal starters out more minutes. So I think that happens, which makes me, I want to bump up. Like the centers that I would look at to see if it works is, can I play Allen and can I play Joval together? The other center I'd look at is, because we can play centers against the Pelicans for the very same reason that we can play centers against Cleveland, is because Joval is going to be out there. They're going to need a big out there. If Nick Richards can't hang, Joval is going to go absolutely nuclear. So I also like Nick Richards because he's 5K and he should get the minutes as long as he stays out of foul trouble. The other thing that I would do is so Dennis Smith, now he was 1 for 10. So he'd been getting extended run off the bench. Against Indy, though, he was 1 for 10 from the field. I think that impacted him a little bit. I'm kind of torn on some of these guys. Like Terry Rozier should get a ton of run. I like him. Kelly Oubre, he's fine too. He's priced up. Then you got Gordon Hayward. who it's like, man, Chalk Gordon Hayward, I never get excited about. Like I never do. So like I might bump him down, and then I might bump like those other guys up a little bit. Like PJ Washington, another guy I just don't get excited about, might bump him down. So really, for the Hornets side, it's probably Rozier, Oubre, maybe Dennis Smith off the bench, and then maybe Nick Richards. But honestly, it could just be like a Pels onslaught too, where they all put up some decent numbers. So this game should be good for fantasy. I do think there's some risk there, though, too, for many different reasons. It's like who's going to get it done on the Charlotte side, where we know Joval, like the most confident guy in this game, I feel is probably Joval, assuming like it looks like his rotation's back. 34 minutes against Houston, 33 minutes against Houston, 27 minutes against the Spurs, but would have been 33-ish had that game not blown out. So I feel very good about his rotation. Yeah. And then the other game is the Knicks and Magic. And Cole Anthony, again, I mean, I know he's going to be a button people pick. I don't trust the Magic. I would rather like under project the Magic side and be more confident on the Knicks side. And the main guys I'm interested in is Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle. And then if Mitch Rob misses, I mean, RJ Barrett, Josh Hart kind of become interesting. Isaiah Hartenstein, if he starts, would be the guy that would probably be chalk. But it's like, so now my question becomes, okay, we talked about two centers we love. Jared Allen, underpriced. I think he's a smash play. Joval could also break the slate if he gets the right run in this matchup. So the question becomes, you know, Hartenstein, how much ownership is he going to get if he starts, if Mitch Rob's out? And it's not like he's ever played a ton of minutes. You could see Thibs just going in a different direction. So that right now is kind of what I'm seeing is one of the main decision points for me on tonight's slate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's an interesting one. Will be interesting to see how the ownerships and also the adjusted ownerships as well for these guys change if we do get news here. We get Robinson out, Hartenstein maybe starting there, how that would change some of the other centers in play here. One of the things you mentioned here as we were going along, I think something always useful to look at is this minutes column over here on the right. We've got Joval projected for about 28 minutes here, which kind of regresses him back a little bit to what he's been playing for most of the season. But, sounds like he's been playing more minutes here recently. If you think this is going to be a little bit higher, like 32, something like that, makes it a strong case for just bumping up the ownership projection or the player projection just from a fantasy point per minute standpoint here. So
actually, I mean, there. So, yeah, Robert and chat, great comment there. Knicks, gosh, I mean, this should have been top of mind just doing the flow chart. But yeah, I mean, Knicks very, struggling defensively. And then without Mitch Rob, if he gets ruled out, obviously he was a downgrade to questionable. Sometimes that leads, to the player being out. He would be hit. He's a good defender, rim protector. And when I think about who, like, the Knicks struggle with, like your Kyle Kuzma types, your wings that can get to the rim or shoot. So Franz Wagner comes to mind. I think this could be a great matchup for him. Paulo, if he can get to his spot right there, free throw line, that corner, that's kind of his spot there. It could be a good game for Paulo, for Franz, and then Cole Anthony too off the bench. So the other Wendell Carter, if Mitch Rob's out, I mean, he's a guy that can get it going. So like. The thing is like I got the Knicks winning this game, but if they can't, here's another thing to consider. If we got the Knicks winning, but Orlando, they play tough at home, and so it's going to be a battle all the way down the stretch. What does that tell me? Probably going to get a ton of Jalen Brunson. Probably going to get high minutes from Julius Randle. Probably going to get more minutes from Josh Hart off the bench, and then RJ Barrett there. Like Quentin Grimes, I see him starting, but finding himself out of the rotation. In the important minutes. So this game for me is definitely becoming more intriguing on this 4-game slate.
Yeah, I like it. Should we hit Bill?
Can we rerun this?
Yeah, let's see what happens.
I always like that. Just talking through it and then you adjusting everything and then we run it and we see where we're at.
Yeah. So we'll target that 20 max you mentioned here. So we've got them set to 20 max. We'll build 20, pool of 1,500. See how things are looking here. So It's cool. I think, when we're talking about the new Saber Score 2.0 stuff and this adjusted ownership, this all works really flexibly with your existing process. Right here, we started the show talking about some of the improvements, some of the changes here, but we can still go through, add our value, make some adjustments to the projections, and still get the impact we're looking for here. So one thing I forgot to mention at the start of this will default to the correct thing here based on the size of the slate and the contest you tell us you're building for here. So we're set to the right value here, and we're seeing a lot of green pop up here, right? Which is good. It means the guys that we bumped up are the guys that we're getting exposure to here. A lot more Jalen Brunson now. Yeah, go ahead.
I like the Larry Nance, and the question you can ask yourself is, why are we getting more Larry Nance now? Well, one, we really like Kawhi Leonard. Two, we like Jalen Brunson. Still under Jalen Brunson should be. I mean, it's closer to being the right price. I got him as like an 8K, maybe 8-1 type of player. He was like 7-2, 7-3. Now he's 7-8. So he's getting closer to what his true price should be relative to his minutes, rotation, and then this matchup. So, but we're needing a value piece. And actually, Larry Nance found himself on the flow chart. So I like that. And we didn't adjust his projection at all. Mm-hmm. And one thing about Larry Nance, he's been dealing with an injury. His minutes are slowly ticking up. So there is some risk there, but he did play 15 minutes against the Spurs. I mean, he's a low usage guy. He's all peripherals. I like him in a matchup like this against sloppy teams where he can get blocks, steals, rebounds. Just understand he does definitely have a low floor. So he's got a low floor and and a higher ceiling relative to his price. So he's a risky value play, for sure. But we are going to need some value on this slate for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, it does jump out here. Another guy, obviously, we're getting a lot of Nick Richards here, so it does kind of make sense in that game script, right? I wonder if we're actually picking up on this here.
I mean, and that's the other question. Sometimes, all right, so I was talking through that, and I'm like, oh, I need Allen and I need Joval. The problem is sometimes forcing those two guys in can actually be a bad play. Really just depends. And when you have a value like Nick Richards right there, it can open up a different type of build too. Like, did we get any Jared Allen and Joval in the same lineup with this run?
Let's see. I don't think we got a lot of Joval period here. So just
what was his projection at?
He was at 38 for 5.35 value here, showing up in about 10% of our lineups in the pool. So those lineups are there, right? We can obviously go dig those up here if we wanted to get a little bit more exposure. Whoops, his name is not literally Joval here. So if we wanted, so we have one lineup in our top 20 here. If we wanted 25%, perfectly fine to go in there and dig those lineups out here. Could also go back to the home screen, give him a little bit more of a bump. Or take it as a sign that we want to go a little bit of a different direction, maybe play more of the Jared Allen, Larry Nance, Nick Richards combinations.
So I want to see what we'll wrap up here shortly, but let's go back to the home screen real quick. I just want to see what those builds will look like. And instead of just bumping them up, just lock in Joval and lock in,
Jared Allen, right?
Jared Allen. Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's build these here for make this run a little quicker.
The other thing too that you could consider is if you're messing around with this, we know we want a big against the Nets. That's where Mobley could be perfect. You could go Mobley, Nick Richards, and Joval in there as a way to where we're attacking what we want to attack. So yeah, what you're seeing there is we're still trying to get Kawhi. Obviously, going to be a good play tonight with no Paul George. We got Brunson in there. And so now it's just we're trying to find that that value, those value pieces. So Eric Gordon, I think he's going to be a fine play too. So some of those builds are definitely interesting. You're getting Gordon Hayward. We're missing out on like the mid tier, like the Kelly Oubre's, Terry Rozier's, those range, which is probably fine. Trying to think who else. Jalen Williams too. It was one of those.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, and it's a tough slate, right? Any of these slates where there's just not value jumping right off the board here makes it a little bit harder with the roster construction here. It can be a little bit harder to find the value to fit the pieces you want here. But I like the way that some of these are looking here.
The other thing too is we know, usually at home they play better defense, but I mean, and we know that like the 232 total from the Clippers, I'm just highly skeptical of that. Like the only way we're getting over that total is if we have Russ and Shea battling. Like those two guys like to push the pace, but this last game that they just played on Tuesday. I mean, I can't remember the total. I think it was like 100, like 102, 103. Chat could probably help me out, but gosh, my concern is Ty Lue slowing the game down. And if that happens, I mean, the other thing you could do, you can make the argument of just like stacking up these first few games, New York, Orlando, Hornets, Pelicans, and like actually be under on Kawhi. Like if Kawhi Leonard was going to be popular, that's another interesting route that you could go on this slate.
Yeah. There was one question here. I saw a question about, maybe I'm a little bit confused here, but looking how to basically set a build so that you're getting a projection of over 280. Your projected score here is listed in the card for each lineup. So 265.7 on this build here. That's going to be like a very slate dependent thing here. I don't know if there are lineups that are projected as high as 280 tonight here. So we probably won't be able to get there. But if you did want to set a projected floor here, there's a couple different ways you could do that. You can set that as a rule here and say to Sabersim, don't build me lineups that are projected for less than, maybe something like 250 on a slate like tonight. You can also filter lineups out here in the build itself. So if we're looking at these lineups here and we just want to see, let's say we're only going to show the lineups here where the projected score is greater than, I don't know, let's try 260. You can get an idea here. So we're eliminating 387 lineups from our pool here. All the lineups with the projection lower than that there. So a couple different ways to do that. Hopefully that answers that question there.
Yeah, cool. No, this was good. This was exciting breakdown. I'm excited with MLB coming up next week. The show is going to be focused on that. We'll make sure we're Thursday is opening day, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll make sure that we either do the show Wednesday or Thursday morning. We could do that too before lock. I think that would be fine, but that will be the focus next week. Do you have any final thoughts? Any final things to add for today, Jordan?
No. I mean, again, if anybody has any questions about this stuff here, the Sabersim channel or in the Run Pure Discord, always a great place to ask. I hope you guys enjoy this stuff. I think it's pretty cool, especially, digging in, looking at those adjusted ownerships versus Sabersim ownerships for different sports and players can be quite a bit of fun. Again, if you're not sure what to do at all, if I've managed to confuse you guys here watching along, this shouldn't really require any changes to your process, right? Probably whatever you were doing was working fine. This is just going to make it a little bit better, especially with the way that we're handling the chalk in some of these spots. So that's all I've got.
Now I'm going to start like one thing I want to do with baseball. Last year, I reverted to kind of my old strategy, just 1 to 5 lineups. This year I want to really embrace Sabersim and a lot of these different tools. So I'm going to do a little 20 max series. And I want to incorporate that into the show too. So like part of it will be each week diving through, like updating where I'm at with I'll track it and everything. I can bring all my stuff up, but it'll be kind of to show people what I'm using for 20 builds and how I'm using all this stuff. And we can fine tune it, go over it, dissect it. It'll be a ton of fun.
I like it. Yeah. I'm looking forward to baseball.
Cool. All right, everyone. Again, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Helps us out a lot. If you have any other questions, hit me up in Discord or on Twitter. Shoot me a DM. If there's anything you want us to cover, shoot me a message. We'll make sure that we cover it.
Real quick, I got to address this one. I know we're wrapping up, but last second question here because I want to squash this. Beantown said, is the prospective ownership percentages aggregated from what people are inputting in the lineup builders? No, it is not. So we are not taking real builds that people are running and using those to build our ownership projections. I know this has come up a little bit before. I think that's a little bit shady if anybody were to be doing that. Your lineups are like totally private. They're not used to generate data that anybody else is seeing here in the app. So they're run by basically taking, we take an industry average projection, what we think the field is likely to think of players. And then we run a really large build with those projections and use that as our ownership projections. But we're not taking your builds or our community's builds or anything like that to generate those. So just wanted to be very clear about that because I saw that question pop up here. So
Yeah, good stuff. Good question also. But yeah, with that, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. We very much appreciate it. But with that, I'm AP. That's Jordan. I'll get us out of here.